Okay. Hi, Damian.
Hi, Reinier. How are you?
I'm good. What about you?
Very fine. Very happy that there's now some days off due to the holiday in Germany. So I'm very good that this is taking place.
Yes, and I'm happy that we can talk about the Eurozone budget. To be honest, I must say it's a topic that sometimes is a bit dry to me, and I don't think I understand the whole entirety of it. So perhaps could you start with explaining what is the Eurozone budget and why is it important now?
Yeah, I can do that. I mean, to be honest, it was a bit dry to me also for quite some time, so it's no surprise. I mean, actually, some time ago, Macron, when he was like basically newly elected, tried together with Merkel to say, look, it doesn't work that we only have a monetary response to save the Eurozone and the euro if whenever there's a financial crisis or a debt crisis, as there was also the last time around. And so he said, like the ECB often says, so the European Central Bank says, like, we need to be able to invest money across Europe together as basically one monetary union. And to make that work, they thought, okay, how about we do that best on the EU level? And we set up an instrument, and it was like titled the Eurozone budget, that would allow us basically to invest money centrally into the Eurozone, also as a response to, for example, any crisis. And then, I mean, from then onwards, like it went through a lot of discussions. And in the end, to be honest, like when I took over this instrument as like the representative from the Green Group working on it, everybody said, look, this thing is dead. Yeah, it doesn't move. Nobody in the European Council, so like from basically the ministers of finance or the heads of state cares about this anymore. Like there's no agreement. We don't really know with it.
And I remember this was before the Corona crisis that the Dutch stance, I'm from the Netherlands, so I get a lot from the Dutch stance or a lot of information about it, was we have to stick to the 1% of our GDP, and the disgraceful attitude of our prime minister was to bring a book to a negotiation saying, my stance is clear, 1%, and that's it. And I don't feel like talking, so I'm going to read a book here, which is not the way to treat people that you're in a team with, basically. But the Corona crisis, it changed that entirely. Can you tell us something about that change?
Yeah, so I have to clarify a bit because there's, I mean, it is technical, so it's quite complex, but there's this one instrument that is titled the Eurozone budget, but it's not the EU budget. It's something completely different. It's like this one little thing where they thought, okay, let's have some money in a pot that we can like spend when there's crisis or generally for the Eurozone as a so-called fiscal response. But then there is the overall budget. So, and there, I mean, you have in the EU, it's a bit more complex than everywhere else. You have a yearly budget, but you also have a 7-year framework budget, which is called the multi-annual financial framework. And that is basically the most important negotiation, if you want, that happens in 7 years.
What a word, multi-annual financial framework. But I believe that the Corona crisis actually stirred the idea in the European Commission to combine these two.
So what happened is that, I mean, we are anyway supposed to negotiate currently about the multi-annual financial framework because the next, so these 7 years, like the last 7 years, if you want, they end of this year. So if there's no agreement on the multi-annual financial framework, so on the 7-year budget for the next 7 years, next year the EU can't really spend any money. Yeah? I mean, that simply put, there would be basically all programs stopped and so on. I mean, it's a bit more complex than that because some programs would continue, blah, blah, but like in short, there would be no agreement on how to finance the next 7 years of the EU. And so these negotiations were going on. And as you said, I mean, the Dutch said, like, look, we don't want to spend any money. The Germans said, we don't want to spend any money. There's basically Parliament said, okay, that we need to spend 1%, 1.3% of GDP. And basically all the heads of state said, no, we only want to spend via this budget 1% of GDP. And that was the big debate. There's billions of euros in between these two positions, and they couldn't really find an agreement.
Yeah,
and
which then, is in absolute numbers, it's big. But
yeah, it's a lot of money. Yeah.
But if you look at it relatively to the budgets of the nation states themselves, then it's actually a pretty small amount.
Yeah, it's definitely true. I mean, like, it's still absolutely true that the EU spends far less than, I mean, like a useful federal state should be spending. I think that's absolutely clear. And also, I mean, this whole discussion about the administration in Brussels being so expensive is also really a joke. I think it's less expensive than the Paris administration. So, like, I mean, really isn't that much of a big deal. Even though, I mean, I was the, like, let's open some brackets, but I was also responsible for the budget of the parliament, so only the parliament's internal spending for the next year. And I obviously try to make it more prudent and make sure that we don't spend money on stupid stuff. But in the end, I mean, the amounts are really not that big. But let's go to the MFF. So you have the MFF, yes. And that's the 7-year budget. And there's like 1.3% parliament, and I don't know, 1% of GDP. It says the council, they fight and they can't really find an agreement. And then there's this debt instrument that I talked about, the Eurozone budget, which is like this one pot of money where people thought, okay, it would be good to have that, not to basically be able to save the euro if a crisis should hit. And then Corona crisis hit, and there were discussions a lot about, okay, so we have a very bad health response on the EU level. Okay, that's a given. It happened. We were really shitty. We blocked masks and so on, and even medical personnel to go to Italy, like from a German perspective. And only after a while we were able to really show solidarity. So that wasn't very successful, and I think shows again that we have to reform the EU. But anyways, and then comes the financial, or like the economic crisis, more like an economic crisis, following or ensuing the health response. And now they say, okay, what do we do now to help countries? And why? I mean, the big question is, why do you even think that you should have some form of a recovery package? I mean, what do you think?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go no, continue.
I mean, if you have an idea, let's tell me. Why do you think that you need to invest in other countries, for example, from the Dutch?
It's pretty obvious. If you look at it from a European perspective, if we make everybody benefit from a bad situation, from the solution for a bad situation, we will eventually, as a whole, become better as well. And from a Dutch perspective, there can't be a rich north without a rich south, because our economies are so intertwined. More than a third of Dutch GDP comes from exports. So it is an absolute necessity. And that's why I also think that the Dutch stance, and also the, I think, Danish, Austrian stance, is against their own logic and very short-sighted. So I think that the position we made as Volt in response to that is the right response.
So I fully agree. And I mean, these discussions were basically, I mean, the heads of state had them together, and the finance ministers had them, and they couldn't really agree on anything. And that happened, I think, already 2 months ago or 1 month ago, that they started these discussions about the best economic response, shared economic response. And that was also the meeting then when your Dutch prime minister, or whoever it was, finance minister, I don't actually remember, came with a book and said, like, I don't care, you know, I won't give you money. And that was it's stupid. And I think also from a German perspective, it's the same. You know, we export 70% of our exports, is the last time I checked, to the EU, other countries. Yeah, so it's absolutely vital for us that people have enough money in other countries to be able to buy our stupid cars, if you want. So it's it was clear, I think, from if you have a longer perspective, even if you have an egoistic, nationalistic perspective, you should be interested in helping other countries.
Besides the even more important argument that it is, I think, the right thing to do to help other people that are in need. I mean, that's the basic first step. And then the second one is, it's also in your own self-interest.
Correct. I fully agree. And I mean, if you see that now, for example, 67% was one poll in Italy, that 67% of people want to leave the EU within Italy, is also, I think, another sign that it's really time, you know, to think what we can do together. But okay, so the heads of state and the finance ministers couldn't really find, or national leaders couldn't really find, like, an agreement. And then they said, how about European Commission, you try to figure it out, you know, like, you make us a proposal of how we can build a recovery program together. So that happened. And then the European Commission tried to like figure something out, but they couldn't find really an agreement within themselves neither. So you have von der Leyen as the president of the European Commission, you have Gentiloni as an Italian representative, you have Herr Hahn as an Austrian representative, and like all these people, you know, having different ideas about, and Vestager, for example, like, so they all have different ideas about what makes sense, and couldn't really come to a clear idea of what was going on. But the one thing that was already, at least within the administration side of the Commission, you know, discussed and therefore also leaked at some point, is that they wanted to take this, you know, that instrument that I talked about, the Eurozone budget that you asked me first about, and make this the centerpiece of the recovery program. And that obviously is super interesting because first they didn't decide to just build, you know, something outside the EU, like a pot of money like the ESM, which is basically a non-EU fund, if you want. Just an intergovernmental thing, but they wanted to do it within the budget, and so within the EU's budget, and use a specific tool, this Eurozone budget that I was already working on.
So with that, finding one solution for two problems.
Exactly, and I mean, from my perspective, it is quite smart to use this tool, because if you change it a bit, so if you increase its size, if you make sure that the money can go where it's needed, not only the countries, but also the regions where it's needed and being, you know, used for the right things, in my view, that is definitely green recovery and sustainable recovery investments and resilience reforms. So like to basically make sure that our administrations are digital, that our healthcare systems are, you know, capable and sufficient, and like that if you finance all these things, that helps the economy in these countries, but you also create resilience versus future shocks, and you can maybe kickstart with some, you know, sustainable investments, the shift of transition to a more green economy and green energy provision. And so this is my big hope, that this tool, the Eurozone budget, will have the right, if you want, scope and objectives, strategic objectives in it, so that people then from the different countries can apply for money and use it in the right way. So to get a bit more technical, even more, sorry for that.
Even more technical. Yeah, because I have actually a follow-up question on that, because you have this hope, but you're also our European parliamentary member representing voters from each European country. What are you doing in your day-to-day work to make this hope you have and this stance that Volt have become a reality? I know you can't decide that by yourself, but obviously there's things going on to try and steer it in this direction. So what is it that you do concretely?
So this time we were actually pretty lucky, because once Corona hit, like a week later or so, I brought the team together in the European Parliament. So like basically the 4 people that I work with in my office. And I said, like, look, let's have a discussion about each of our topics and see how they're going to get impacted by the Corona crisis. Just to understand, you know, is this going to be something that will be completely deprioritized, or will this be something that will be more important? And why we did that, I mean, we learned a lot about our other topics, but when we looked at the Eurozone budget, we thought actually this could be a cool instrument to be at the core of a recovery program. And so this was before the Commission even talked about it. And what we did then is we reached out to the other shadows. Shadows are the people from the other political groups that are working with you on that specific instrument or file. A legislative piece, if you want them. And so we wrote them a message and said, like, hey, how about we have a shadows meeting, which wasn't planned, and said, like, how about we have a shadows meeting to have a political discussion whether this tool could be actually at the core of the new recovery program, and that we can actually change it from what it's currently at, which was a tool for competitive and convergence. I mean, like, forget about that, but like, anyways, more like a neoliberal tool, if you want, it doesn't really matter, and change it to a recovery and resilience tool. And actually that happened. So the shadows took this up, and we had a shadow meeting where we exchanged, and we already tried to push for recovery and resilience to be at its core, which was luckily taken up by the other groups. And then in the second stage, like after some meetings, we said, like, look, how about, I have to take a step back. There are 2 different camps evolved while we were discussing. Some said, the more conservative said, look, this is a tool which is supposed to run for 7 years. We learned throughout the 7 years, you know, time of the multi-annual framework, financial framework. And we want this money to only go to really reform countries, you know, more in the Dutch-German perspective, to be, you know, an efficient administration. And this is more like for, it needs to be bound by very clear guidelines from the European level of, you know, making you fiscally more prudent and blah, blah. And the other side said, look, we are in a huge crisis, so we need to invest money fast now. And like I also said, you know, in recovery and resilience and green energy transition and so on. And these two camps were fighting. And so what we did, and it was actually Johannes' idea, so like one of my assistants that I work with, he said, like, how about we stage it? How about we make the first 2 years really just focus on recovery and resilience, and we spent around 50% of the money via this, you know, the scope. And the last 5 years, if you want, we spend 50% of the money, and we do it more in the traditional, you know, conservative Dutch-German perspective, if we want, saying like, this money needs to be used to build convergence and competitiveness, and everybody, you know, blah, blah. So more like, if you want, the fiscally prudent and strict side. So a lot of money already spent on recovery and resilience. So we did this. It was luckily actually taken up by one big political group, and we submitted it as amendments to the legal text. So it's really like the Green Group now submitted this as actually, you know, written legal words, if you want. And so what we are basically hoping now is that this will be taken up and introduced into the text. But sadly, the complexity is not done yet, because this legal text is still based on an old draft that came from the European Commission. And if the European Commission makes this tool the center of the recovery of their program, you know, their idea of the recovery program, they might rewrite it. You know, they might rewrite the complete thing and hand us over a new file and say, here is the new resilience and recovery tool. And if that happens, then we have to, you know, start from scratch when it comes to the legal amendments and so on, or legal text amendments. But the ideas are already there, and they're in the heads of the people that we work with. And we also shared them with the Commission. We tested them actually with different countries, the ministries of finance. And so we hope that via, you know, like this thought work that we already did, we can then be very fast when it comes to a new text. Sorry, just now it's enough with technicalities. But in the end, very simply put, it could be that around 200 billion euros are being spent by this tool. So we really care, obviously, for every word and of the scope and objectives that are in there.
Yeah, and it's for everybody that's still watching and going through these technical and complex things, it is quite logical that it has to be this complex, because it is so many different people with so many different needs and expectations, and so much money and such an important role it will have for the future of our continent, that it's logical that to take all those different elements into account and come to a right solution, that it needs to be complex.
Yeah, I think the one thing that I do understand though still is that, I mean, that's basically the basic premise of Volt, you know, that this decision-making processes on the EU level are still not working so well, and that is mainly due to the fact that they're intergovernmental, you know, that basically the German Minister of Finance is mostly interested in not losing his voters in Germany, and therefore fights for mostly German solutions and so on. And I mean, now Merkel and Macron did a big step towards like the right direction of saying, let's actually indebt ourselves together on the European level and spend this money via this tool that I just described. But still, I mean, I think it would be so much easier and faster, and we would have been better in the health response, and we could have been better in the economic and financial response if we just had more functioning decision-making processes. And that would mean to have a commission that can actually propose something, and a parliament that votes for it, and then, I mean, I wouldn't say that's it, but, you know, a third body which basically checks that no boundaries are being broken. But apart from that, it's a functioning decision-making process, and not like this where we have 27 different member states basically still calling the shots, if you're honest.
Yeah.
I think that's not a good way.
I fully agree. That's exactly what Volt is about. If we make that more, if we make that function better, we can have so much swifter response while still taking those different things into account. It was interesting that Merkel also said that the nation state alone has no future. And it was also, for me, interesting because the Christian Democrats, as I see them in Germany, are quite welcoming to refugees and migrants and are pro-European, while the Dutch Christian Democrats seem to be very different, or at least Merkel seems to be both of those things.
It's true. I mean, relatively, I think you're right. Yeah? There is, if I look at different countries, yeah, the debate seems to be a bit more open, and sometimes, even though it's hard for me to accept or like to actually to say this out loud, but I do see the Ministry of the Interior sometimes moving ahead, for example, with relocations and so on, when it comes to migration. But like, and it's a conservative-run ministry. But very often I also see that they don't do enough. And Merkel, I mean, it took her, now the second financial crisis in her many years of governance to actually do something. The first time around, you can, I think, quite openly say, failed in building a recovery program for the European Union, which cost her a lot of credibility and cost the EU a lot of credibility. And it's basically the reason for a lot of, I mean, it's a bit hard to say, but like, is one of the reasons of right-wing populism rising.
Yeah. So I think we should go and wrap this up. Is there one final, if you want people to remember one thing from this conversation, what do you want people to walk away with?
There are a couple of things. First, we need to spend money together across the European Union, because some of these countries can't do it alone anymore. And if we just leave them alone, we will all suffer from it. And it's not a sign of solidarity. I think that's the first one. The second one is, it's really cool that the money is supposed to be spent via the EU and not like an intergovernmental thing, because we need to strengthen the EU and its financial means and make sure that the EU can do that it's invested into our future, digital, sustainable, resilience kind of topics. And the third one is, we definitely need to change the institutions to be able to take better decisions.
Thanks. And if I would like to add one thing to that, and that is that if you walk away with this, walk away with the thought that only a Europe that acts together can solve our shared challenges. And on that note, I wish you a good day. And this was an interesting session that at least opened my eyes again to a better understanding of this difficult and technical subject. Thanks.
Thanks for watching, and thanks for the very good questions, Reinier, and ideas. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.